The fluorescent lights in the recovery room buzzed like trapped flies above my head. My back was wrapped in enough bandages to fill a small suitcase, and every breath I took felt like someone dragging a rusted nail across my spine. The surgery had gone well, the doctor said. 8 hours on the table, 2 titanium rods, and a future that looked something like normal again if I followed the program, if I did the work, if I was patient. I was good at being patient. My wife walked in at 2:14 inches the afternoon. I remember the time because I had been watching the clock, the way you do when you're on enough painkillers that time becomes a strange elastic thing. She wasn't alone. There was a man behind her in a gray suit, slim briefcase, the kind of polished look that meant he billed by the hour. I'd never seen him before, but I knew what he was the second I saw the envelope in her hand. She didn't say hello. She didn't ask how I was feeling. She set the envelope on the tray table next to my water cup and slid it toward me the way you'd push a receipt across a counter. "Marcus," she said, "I need you to sign these today." I looked at the envelope. Then I looked at her. She hadn't changed clothes from this morning. Same cream blazer, same gold earrings she wore when she wanted to feel powerful. She had driven 2 hours from Portland to this hospital room not to see how her husband had survived spinal surgery, but to make sure he signed the paperwork before he got too comfortable recovering. "Divorce papers?" I said. "Not a question. It's the cleanest option," she said, "before things get complicated." The lawyer shifted his weight near the door. He had the good sense to look at the floor. I thought about the 8 hours I had spent unconscious on that table. I thought about the moment before they put me under, when the anesthesiologist had asked if there was anything I wanted them to pass along to my family, just in case. I had said no. I hadn't called my wife because she had told me the week before the surgery that she was going to her sister's in Sacramento and wouldn't be available. I found out later she had been in Portland the entire time. She just hadn't come. I picked up the pen from the tray. She straightened slightly, like she had been expecting an argument and was relieved not to get one. I signed, set the pen down, looked at her. "One thing," I said. My voice was calm. The painkillers helped, but it was mostly just me. I've never been a man who raises his voice. "When you get back to the office Monday, pull up the vendor contracts on the Meridian project." She frowned. "What? Why?" "Just do it," I said. "Check the name on the primary contractor." She stared at me for a second, clearly deciding whether that was a threat or the medication talking. Then she picked up the envelope, nodded once at the lawyer, and walked out. Her heels clicked down the corridor and faded. The nurse who came in 20 minutes later to check my vitals gave me a careful look. "You okay?" I smiled at the ceiling. "Better than I've been in a while. Let me back up. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 32 years old. For the last 4 years I've been the lead structural engineer at a mid-size firm in Portland called Greystone Civil. I make a decent salary. I drive a 6-year-old truck. I own exactly one suit that I wear to funerals and client presentations. If you passed me on the street, you would not look twice. My wife, my ex-wife, I should say, is Diane. She works in commercial real estate development. She is the kind of person who reads the room the moment she enters it and immediately calculates how much every person in it is worth to her. I say that now. I didn't see it clearly until much later. When you love someone, you narrate their sharpness as ambition and their coldness as focus. You give people the best version of themselves in your own head, and you pay for that generosity eventually. We met 6 years ago at a conference in Seattle. She laughed at something I said, and I was gone. 2 years later we were married. She kept her last name, which I respected. She said it was for professional continuity. I understand now it was also practical planning. For the first 3 years, things were fine. Not perfect, but real. Then her company started growing. She got promoted. Started traveling more. Started looking at our apartment the way you look at a car you've outgrown, grateful for what it was, already researching what comes next. The injury happened 14 months before the divorce papers. A site accident. I wasn't even doing anything reckless. I was walking an inspection on a commercial build in Beaverton, a beam shifted wrong, and I went down hard. Herniated 2 discs, compressed a third. For 4 months I worked from home, moving carefully, sleeping on the floor because it hurt less than the mattress. My wife was supportive in the early weeks. Then she got busy again. I noticed small things. She stopped asking how the physical therapy was going. She started taking calls in the other room. She came home later and later, always with clean explanations that I never challenged because I trusted her or because I didn't want to know. I'm still not entirely sure which. The surgery was the last option after conservative treatment stopped working. I had been on the table 8 hours, screws and rods holding my lumbar spine together, and my wife was 45 minutes away not answering her phone. What she didn't know, what she had never bothered to know, was that 3 months before the surgery, I had sat down with my attorney and started moving pieces quietly. Here is a thing about me that my wife somehow never learned in 6 years of marriage. My father built a small construction company in Bend, Oregon when I was 12 years old. He ran it until he died, when I was 24. He left it to me. I restructured it, renamed it, moved it under a holding entity called Webb Construction LLC. I kept my name off the public-facing materials because I was 24 and terrified and didn't know what I was doing yet, so I used my middle name on the operating agreement. Reed. Marcus Reed. Webb, full legal name. Most people know me as Marcus Webb. The company is owned by M. Reed Webb. The contracts, the licenses, the bank accounts, all Reed. My wife knew I had some connection to a construction company my father had left me. She had heard me mention it maybe twice. She never asked about it the way you ask about something that matters to you. It was furniture in the background of our life together, and she had never once looked closely at it. What my wife did know was that her company, Harlow and Vance Development, had just landed the biggest contract of their year, the Meridian Project, a mixed-use development in downtown Portland worth about $40 million. She had worked that deal for 8 months. She had told me about it over dinner one evening, glowing, saying it was going to change everything for her career. I had listened carefully. I had congratulated her. I had not mentioned that the primary structural contractor on the Meridian project was Webb Construction LLC, which I owned entirely, which my attorney had spent the last 3 months quietly restructuring in anticipation of a divorce I had seen coming for longer than I wanted to admit. The drive back from the hospital alone was one of the loneliest things I have ever done. A nurse had helped me into a rideshare because I couldn't drive. I sat in the back seat with my discharge papers and a prescription bottle and watched the Oregon trees go by and felt absolutely nothing for a long time. Then I got home, took my medication, lay carefully on my side on the floor with a pillow under my knees, and I waited. The first sign came 6 days after I was discharged. I was staying at my friend Danny's place. An old college friend, one of the few people who knew everything. I had moved a bag out of the apartment before the surgery because I knew I wouldn't be going back. Diane had sent 2 texts in those 6 days. One said, "Hope recovery is okay." The other said, "Let me know when you want to arrange pickup of your things." On the 7th day, she posted something on Instagram. A photo of herself at dinner, candlelight, glass of red wine, across from someone whose arm was visible at the edge of the frame. The caption said, "New beginnings deserve a toast." She had posted it at 9:45 on a Tuesday. I looked at it for a long time. Not from jealousy. I was past that. I looked at it because it told me everything I needed to know about the timeline she had been operating on without my knowledge. You don't post new beginnings 7 days after your husband gets out of back surgery unless you made peace with the ending long before the papers were signed. I put my phone down and called my attorney. We talked for 40 minutes. By the end of the call, 3 things had been set in motion that I will not detail entirely here, but the shape of them matters. First, the vendor agreement between Webb Construction and Harlow and Vance on the Meridian project contained a clause standard, legal, present in every contract we issue that allowed the primary contractor to withdraw from a project within a renegotiation window if there was a material change in the professional relationship between key stakeholders. My attorney had made sure that clause was worded broadly enough to be meaningful. It was now meaningful. Second, Webcrest had been providing Harlow and Vance with cost estimates and structural certifications that their team was using to pitch 3 other developments currently in the approval phase. Those certifications were provided under a service agreement that renewed monthly. The next renewal was in 11 days. Third, the office Diane leased for her personal real estate LLC, the side business she ran separate from Harlow and Vance, the one she used for her own commissions and consulting work, was in a building managed by a property group called Cascade Commercial Partners. Cascade Commercial Partners was a subsidiary of Webcrest Holdings. She had been paying rent to me for 2 years without knowing it. The lease was month to month. I did not feel powerful sitting on Danny's couch eating soup I could barely taste because my body was still rebuilding itself. I felt tired and sad and older than 32. But I also felt, for the first time since the beam came down on me in Beaverton, like the ground under my feet was solid. I did not contact Diane. I let the silence sit. On day 11, the service agreement with Harlow and Vance was not renewed. I heard about the fallout secondhand, through Danny, who had a contact at Harlow and Vance's office. Diane had gone to her director with what she thought was a routine renewal and been told the contractor had declined to continue the relationship without explanation. The structural certifications she needed for 2 pending projects were now in limbo. One of those projects had a city presentation in 3 weeks. She called me that evening. I let it ring. She called again. I let it ring again. She texted, Marcus, I think there's an issue with one of our vendors. Did you have anything to do with Webcrest Construction? I looked it up and there's a read Webb listed as that connected to your family somehow? I read the text. Set my phone down. Made tea. She was close. Close enough to feel the heat. But not close enough to understand the full shape of what she was standing in. 2 days later, the Meridian Project primary contract was formally suspended pending renegotiation. Harlow and Vance's team was blindsided. The $40 million deal that had been Diane's crowning achievement was sitting in neutral with no timeline for resolution. Her director sent a formal inquiry to Webcrest requesting a meeting. My attorney responded on our behalf with a polite, professional letter that cited the clause and indicated we would be reviewing our vendor relationships through the end of the quarter. No personal language. No names. Just the clean machinery of business. Diane called again that night. This time I picked up. Marcus. Her voice was controlled, but I knew her well enough to hear the strain underneath. I need to know if you're behind the Webcrest situation. What makes you think that? Because Reed Webb is your middle name. Because your father's company was called Webb Construction and you told me once you changed it. I told you that, I said. You're right. Apasa. What are you doing? What clause are you referring to specifically? I said. There are several in the vendor agreement. Marcus, this is my career. This isn't about us. You brought the lawyer to the hospital room, I said. The day after my surgery. Not to see me? To get a signature. Silence. Everything that happens next is the natural consequence of legitimate business decisions, I said. I wish you well, Diane. I hope you can get it sorted. I hung up. I'm not proud of how good that felt. But I'm not going to lie about it either. The next 10 days moved fast. The lease termination notice for her personal LLC office went out from Cascade Commercial Standard 30-day notice, polite and formal. She didn't connect it immediately. Then her assistant figured it out and told her. That was, from what I heard later, not a good afternoon in that office. The 2 pending development projects she had been shepherding lost their structural approval timeline. One of the developers pulled back and began looking for another firm. Harlow and Vance's quarterly numbers were going to look different than they had planned. Her director called a meeting. Diane was not fired. I want to be clear about that. I didn't do anything that wasn't cleanly within my rights, and I wasn't trying to destroy her, just to let the weight of what she had built on assumptions land where it was supposed to land. But she was taken off the Meridian project. Given other accounts. Smaller ones. I had been cleared for short walks by that point, moving slowly around Danny's neighborhood in the mornings with a cane I hated but needed. I was in a strange emotional place. Numb some days. Unexpectedly angry at odd moments, not at Diane, but at myself. For all the times I had noticed something was wrong and told myself a comfortable story instead. A mutual friend told me Diane had been asking around about me, trying to understand the full scope of what Webcrest actually was, what it owned, what it did. She had apparently been genuinely shocked. 6 years of living with me, and she had never once sat down and asked, how does that work? What did your father actually build? What do you actually own? She had decided. Early in our relationship, what kind of person I was: a steady, unexciting engineer, with a modest career and a dead father's small company somewhere in the background, and she had never revisited that file. The Marcus Webb in her head was a known quantity. A comfortable one, until he became inconvenient. She had never met Reed. The month after the surgery was the hardest of my life in ways that had nothing to do with Diane. Physical therapy 3 times a week. Learning to trust my own spine again. Wondering if I would ever stand on a job site and feel like myself. There were nights at Danny's where I stared at the ceiling for hours and thought about how much I had wanted that marriage to work. How many times I had dismissed my own instincts to keep the peace. How much of my silence over those last 2 years had been patience and how much had been fear. But I kept going to therapy. I kept doing the exercises. I kept showing up. Around week 6 post-surgery, I started working again. Remote consulting at first, then slowly getting back to real projects. The work helped more than anything else. There's something about calculations that steadies me when the numbers are right, they're right, and nothing in the world can argue with them. I did not contact Diane again. She tried once more, 3 weeks after the Cascade lease notice. A longer message this time, something about miscommunication and moving too fast and how she had been overwhelmed when I was injured and hadn't handled it well. She said she thought we could come to an arrangement about the Meridian contract. She said she had been talking to her therapist. I read it carefully. I believed parts of it. The part about being overwhelmed was probably true. The part about wanting to come to an arrangement was definitely true. I wrote back one sentence: the divorce proceedings are with my attorney, who will be in touch. I wish you the best. Her attorney and my attorney negotiated for 6 weeks after that. I was not present for any of it. I had made my position clear to my attorney. I wanted a clean settlement, fair division of what we had actually built together, and no drama. I wasn't trying to take anything from her that was genuinely hers. I just wasn't going to pretend that anything in our shared life had been built on her foundation instead of mine. The settlement was fair. I won't go into specifics. The week the divorce was finalized, I drove back to Bend. I hadn't been there since my father's funeral. I pulled up to the small yard where he had kept his equipment, parked my truck, and sat there for a long time looking at the building he had built with his hands. I thought about my father, who had worked construction for 30 years and never once made anyone feel small. Who had handed me a company with no fanfare and no instruction manual. Who would have hated how the last 2 years had gone but would have understood every decision I made to protect what he had built. I got out of the truck. I walked around the building slowly, leaning on my cane, checking things. The structure was sound. Some of the siding needed attention. The gutters were full. I called my site manager in Portland and told him I was ready to come back full time. He said good, because he had 3 bids that needed my sign-off. I signed them as M. Reed Webb, same as always. What I understand now, that I didn't understand when I was lying in that hospital bed watching my wife click her heels toward the exit, is that she was never cruel in the way that requires malice. She was cruel in the simpler, quieter way of someone who only ever saw the version of you that was useful to her. When I was useful, she was warm. When I became a liability, a husband in recovery, slower, needing care she didn't want to give, she updated her calculation and moved on. She didn't lie to me. She just never asked enough questions to know the truth. And the hard part, the thing I've had to sit with in physical therapy and long drives and early mornings when the back aches before the medication kicks in, is that I let that happen. I made myself easy to underestimate. I was so determined not to be the man who waves his accomplishments around, so determined to be steady and quiet and reliable, that I became invisible inside my own marriage. I gave her a version of me and then felt hurt that it wasn't enough without ever offering her the rest. That's not her fault entirely. That's mine. But I also think there are people who, even if you laid everything out in front of them, the documents, the contracts, the history, would still only see what they wanted to see. Would still look at the man in the physical therapy room and calculate whether he was worth their time. And for those people, the only honest response is to let them make their choice and then let the weight of it land naturally. I don't have a foundation named after anyone. I didn't call a press conference. I didn't need to. The Meridian project resolved without me. They found another contractor. As they should have. Harlow and Vance had a hard quarter and then recovered. As companies do. Diane took a new position at a smaller firm in Seattle 6 months after the divorce was finalized. I heard that secondhand. I hope she's doing well. I mean that the way you mean something when you've decided to stop carrying it. I walked my first job site without a cane, 14 months after the surgery. A mixed-use build in Salem, nothing special. But I stood on the concrete foundation in the cold morning air and looked at the framing going up and felt something click back into place inside me that had been loose for a long time. One of the younger engineers on my team asked me something that afternoon. We were going over load calculations, and he made a comment about how I seemed like I'd been doing this forever, like nothing rattled me. He asked how long I'd been in the field. I thought about it. Long enough, I said, to know that the structure is what matters. You can dress the outside any way you want. But if you don't do the work underneath where no one's watching, it all comes down eventually. He nodded like it was just advice about buildings. It was. But it was also everything else. My father used to say that the best construction is invisible. The things that hold are the things you never see, the rebar inside, the concrete, the bolts behind the wall, the foundation buried in the ground. Nobody photographs the foundation. Nobody posts the foundation on their Instagram. But when everything else shifts, it's the only thing left standing. I am still rebuilding. The back is mostly good now, some days better than others. I have a real apartment again. I cook dinner most nights. I go to sleep at a reasonable hour. I am, for the first time in several years, genuinely at ease in my own life. I don't need anyone to know what I built. The building knows.